Okay, let's continue on in our discussion of discharge by performance. Next up, we're going to talk about a certain condition that can be attached to contracts called a personal satisfaction condition. Some contracts have this condition in them that make them subject to one party's personal satisfaction. Honestly, this is not very common, and it's not really a big deal. You don't see this very often, but it is in the textbook, and courts do enforce them. So let's take a look at what we're talking about here. If I come to you and I say, I'll pay you $500 to paint my portrait, but I have to be personally satisfied with the portrait, or I won't pay you anything. And I make this condition very clear to you up front. In fact, the law requires that if we're going to use a personal satisfaction condition, that it has to be made unequivocally clear. But I make it clear to you. I say, okay, I will only pay you if I'm personally satisfied with your painting when we're finished. And knowing this risk, you go ahead and undertake to paint a portrait. Well, when you bring it to me, I was thinking about a portrait like the one on the top of the slide. And what you bring me is a portrait like the one on the bottom. Well, these are both portraits. They're both different types of art. But I had one thing in mind and you had another. So I say to you, no, I'm not satisfied with that. I'm not paying you. All right, if you sued me and we got into court and we argued over whether this personal satisfaction condition was satisfied, then what would a court do with that? Well, that's what we have here on the slide. If it's a personal services contract that's subject to the personal satisfaction condition, like painting is a personal service, then courts will use the subjective standard to determine the condition, whether I was personally satisfied. Although honesty, it says, in good faith are required. So here's what would happen. If we got into court and the question came up, was I really satisfied? The court would use a subjective standard to determine that. This is one of the only times, fairly rare in the law, where a court will apply a subjective standard. Because the subjective standard would ask, what was I truly thinking inside my head? Not would a reasonable person be satisfied with the portrait, but was I truly satisfied with it? And if the court comes to the conclusion that, yeah, or through the evidence actually, that yes, I really was not satisfied, then they would say the condition is not met and I would not be obligated to pay you. And yeah, like you're thinking, proof would be very difficult. Right? You would have to have some sort of smoking gun type evidence to show that I really was satisfied, but I only told you that I wasn't, right? Because we would use the subjective standard. Okay, well, that's what we do with personal services contracts that are subject to personal satisfaction conditions, where the personal satisfaction is a matter of personal taste. What happens if we have a contract that has a personal satisfaction condition, but it really just involves a matter of mechanical fitness or utility? What happens then? Here's my example of that. Let's say this time I come to you and rather than asking you to paint me a portrait, I ask you to install an alarm system in my house. But I put a personal satisfaction condition on it. And I say, well, you know, I feel unsafe at night, and so I want you to install this alarm system. But I will only pay you if I'm personally satisfied with your work. And knowing this, and this condition is up front, you go ahead and undertake to install the alarm system. And you install the alarm system, and it works just like it's supposed to. But I come to you and say, you know, I'm really just not satisfied with your performance here. I still don't feel safe, and so I'm not paying you. If we got into court on that kind of a personal satisfaction condition, a court would not use a subjective test. If the contract involves just a matter of mechanical fitness or utility, then a court would use the objective standard. In other words, if it's not just a matter of personal taste, and it's just a matter of, you know, whether something works or not, mechanical fitness, then a court will use the objective standard, and they would ask the question, would a reasonable person have been satisfied with your installation? If so, they would make me pay for it. Okay, hopefully you can see the difference there. If it's a matter of personal taste or artistic ability, something like that, then a court will use the subjective standard. But if it's simply a matter of mechanical fitness or utility, then a court will use the objective standard to determine whether the personal satisfaction condition was met. And as always, there at the bottom, everyone has to act in good faith, including me If I tell you, for instance, that I'm not satisfied, I have to do that in good faith, not in bad faith just to avoid paying you. Okay, let's talk about the timing of performance, because this becomes an issue sometimes with receiving a discharge through our contract performance. Did we do so in a timely way? Or timing, deadlines, can be conditions and contracts. So let's take a look at how courts treat this. The time for performance is usually a reasonable amount of time, unless the contract requires a specific time frame. Right? I always tell my students that I have to give you the lawyer's answer on this, which is if a contract doesn't say how long you have to perform it, courts say you have a reasonable amount of time. A reasonable amount of time given the subject matter of the contract. Now that can vary widely depending on the subject matter. And that's the standard that courts use to determine timing, unless the contract has a deadline in it, unless the parties themselves agree that performance will be finished by a certain time. But even in that instance, courts still allow a little leeway. So if we say, for instance, in our contract that performance will be due by June 1st, and if that's all we say in our contract, then the courts will look at that and they will read it this way. They'll say, well, the parties have agreed to June 1st as the deadline, but the court will read it as June 1st or a reasonable time thereafter, given the subject matter of the contract. Okay, but what if we really need to have performance by June 1st? What if timing of performance is crucial to the contract? What if June 2nd would really make a difference, and it would be a material difference? How do we get the court to read a deadline as being the strict deadline that we need it to be? Well, we can use what I call magic language. Sometimes in contracts there's magic language that we just put into our contract that transforms the meaning of it, and here's one of those times. We can use this phrase, time is of the essence, or time shall be of the essence of this contract. Just by including that phrase in our contract, we can transform how a court will read it. If we say performance is due by June 1st, then a court will say, oh, June 1st or a reasonable time thereafter. But if we say performance is due by June 1st, time is of the essence, then a court will read it and say, oh, they meant June 1st, not June 2nd or any time thereafter. Time is essential to this contract. Time is of the essence. Timing is important, and the parties agree by putting this language in there that basically this deadline is a condition, right? It's one of the essential parts of the contract that must be performed in order to receive a discharge. So this is one example of how we can have what I call magic language in a contract. Okay, let's take a look at breach. Breach of contract. What happens when you don't perform like you're supposed to? Well, that's where we get into breach. And I probably actually used this term already in our discussion of contracts without defining it. But let's take a look at what is a breach of contract. A breach of contract, of course, is the failure of a party to perform the required contractual duty. You promise to do something, you don't do it. That's a breach. Okay, well, of course, this is the law, so we have to break these things down and further into different categories and conditions and things. And so we do that with breach too. There are different kinds of breach. There's a material breach and a minor breach. And let's take a look at the difference. First, a material breach, material, of course, being important or significant, is where performance under the contract is not even substantial performance. Okay, in this case, the non-breaching party is relieved of their duty to perform. It's a material breach of the contract. A minor breach of the contract is where the non-breaching party, the innocent party, may suspend his or her performance until the breach is remedied or perform in part. Okay, let me give an example of this. Let's say I build you a house. We've contracted, I signed a contract to build a house according to certain plans that you've given me. And I build the house, but I do such a bad job. The walls are already cracking, the foundation is about ready to fall in, it's going to ruin the house isn't even going to stand up, and you can't even use it as a house for very long before it will completely implode. I've done such a poor job. If that's the case, then I have materially breached the contract. My performance is not even substantial performance. You haven't even gotten the important and essential benefits that you contracted for. Remember that discussion under substantial performance? You haven't even gotten substantial performance from me. It's less than substantial. Then I have materially breached the contract. Okay, who cares? So what if it's a material breach? Well, we care because it affects what you have to do or don't have to do. If I have materially breached the contract and my performance isn't even substantial performance, then what that means is you don't have to pay me at all. You are relieved. You receive a discharge because of my breach of the contract. So that's the big deal with material breach, is if one side materially breaches the contract, it results in a discharge for the other side. You don't have to perform an exchange. In terms of a minor breach, what is that and how is that different? A minor breach of the contract really is where we have given substantial performance. Remember, we've given at least the essential benefits of the contract. So I build you a house and it's not exactly according to the plans, but you can use it as a house. Okay, if there's a minor breach, you can come to me and say, hey, you've breached the contract. You didn't give me complete or perfect performance. And you can either give me time to fix the problems, right, the deviations under the contract. You can allow me time to go back and fix them and give you perfect performance, or you can make me make up for those differences, maybe an amount of money or whatever. So if you're going to pay me for building the house, you can withhold a certain amount of money from your performance to make up for those defects. That would be a minor breach. But the difference, the main difference is, if I give a minor breach, or I commit a minor breach of the contract by giving you only substantial instead of perfect performance, you still have to perform in exchange. You still have to pay me. It's just that you may be entitled to the difference between what you contracted for and what you actually got. Let's take a look at some other types of breach that are out there. One is called an anticipatory breach, and the UCC makes use of this from time to time. An anticipatory breach of the contract is where one party to the contract makes it unmistakably clear that they will not be able to perform, that they're going to breach the contract, right? Anticipatory. It's like a breach ahead of time. Okay, an anticipatory breach discharges the non-breaching party. All right, well, let's give you an example of what an anticipatory breach of contract would be. Let's say that I am Western Illinois University, and you have a company that sells a product that Western buys a lot of. Let's say it's Vomsorb. I don't know if you know what Vomsorb is, but if you remember from being in elementary school, and there would be a kid that would throw up in the lunchroom, and the janitor would come in and they would sprinkle this stuff over the vomit. That's Vomsorb, right? Let's just say that Western uses a lot of that, and so Western has contracted with Vomsorb Inc. to buy 50 cases of this stuff to be delivered by June 1st. Okay, and that's the contract. Well, let's say we get to the middle of May, and there's a problem at Vomsorb, and they run out of their materials they used to make the stuff with, and they're not going to be able to make 50 cases. They're not going to be able to deliver on the WIU contract. And so the president CEO of Vomsorb calls up the president of Western Illinois University and says, hey, our contract says that we're going to have to deliver 50 cases of this stuff to you by June 1st. I'm telling you right now, May 15th, we're not going to do it. I'm just going to tell you right now, we're not going to be able to perform. We're going to breach this contract. I just wanted to give you a heads up. Okay. If that's the case, then Vomsorb has anticipatorily breached the contract. And the big deal with that is Western can treat the contract as materially breached right now on May 15th. We don't have to wait until June 1st. So what does that mean? That means WIU would have any of the remedies they would normally have when there's a material breach of the contract. If they have any damages, they could sue Vomsorb right now. Wouldn't even have to wait until June 1st. Or, more likely, in this case, maybe Western goes out and they find another seller of vomit-absorbing chemicals, and they purchase them from someone else. And they don't have to wait till June 1st to see if Vomsorb will perform, because Vomsorb has made it unequivocally clear that they will not perform on May 15th. So WIU can treat it as a breach right then. Also, one other note about this, that would be unusual for one party to call the other on the phone to tell them we're not going to be able to perform, we're going to breach this contract. But that's also not required under anticipatory repudiation. It just has to be unequivocally clear. Just to change the facts a little bit, let's say that Vomsorb declares bankruptcy. And in the Wall Street Journal, there's an article that says Vomsorb CEO in an interview says that the company will be declaring bankruptcy and they will not be living up to any of their remaining contracts. And this is on May 15th. Well, if the president of WIU is reading the Wall Street Journal and reads that article and knows that WIU is included in those contracts, then Vomsorb has made it unequivocally clear that they're not going to perform. And as of the date that the interview appears in the Wall Street Journal, there's an anticipatory breach of the contract. And WIU could treat it as a breach on May 15th or whatever date that article appears. Another issue that comes up from time to time here with performance is the statute of limitations. All right, this is discharge of a contract by legal defense, we might say, right, or by statute. And here we have the statute of limitations. Many of you might already know what that is. The statute of limitations is a law that restricts the period of time during which a party may sue for a breach. So if you and I have a contract and you breach it, and it's clear you've materially breached the contract, but I wait too long, I wait 50 years and then try to sue you for breach of contract, the law would say, no, I can't sue you. I can't go to court to try to enforce that contract because I've waited too long. The statute of limitations has run. There's a period, a limited period of time, that the law allows to enforce a contract through the court process. And if I wait too long, I'm barred. Actually, Illinois, and I put this on the slide, has a pretty long statute of limitations. And you can see there that for oral contracts, Illinois statute of limitations is 5 years, and for written contracts, it's 10. Whereas generally under the UCC, it's only 4 years from, and notice it's also, the statute of limitations starts running from the date of the default of the contract, not the date that the contract was entered into, but the date on which it becomes in default or when it's breached. So we start counting from the date of the breach and go forward in Illinois for 5 or 10 years, and under the UCC for 4 years. Other states have different statute of limitations. You just have to look them up depending on where you are, but most of them are shorter than Illinois'. But the key point on this is the time of the statute starts running on the date of the default. Okay, let's look at some other sort of defenses to performance of a contract here. And one that comes up from time to time is impossibility. What happens if you and I enter into a contract and our performance under the contract becomes impossible? Circumstances change, facts change, and they make our performance impossible, physically impossible. What happens? Well, we receive a discharge. And I have some examples here of impossibility. Factual impossibility is first. This is where the party to a contract cannot perform because first they've died or become incapacitated while under a personal services contract. Right? If I contract with you to paint your house and I'm in a traffic accident and I go into a coma, I'm physically unable to come and paint your house, well then I'm discharged, right? Because of factual impossibility. It's now impossible for me to perform that. Or if the subject matter of the contract is completely destroyed, well then we're discharged through impossibility. So if I contract to paint your house and your house is completely destroyed by a tornado, well then I don't have to come paint it. It's impossible. I mean, I suppose I could paint the boards on the ground, but that's not exactly the same. The purpose of the contract would be destroyed along with your house. So we're discharged. Or last, a change in the law renders performance illegal all of a sudden. So let's say that you want to rent a room in my house. Right? Let's say I have a room over my garage, and housing is kind of tight around campus, and you want to rent this room over my garage. And so we sign a lease, and you're going to move in, in January. But between now and January, the city of Macomb changes its zoning laws. And now it changes the zoning in my neighborhood to single-family use only. In other words, it makes it illegal for me to rent out part of my house to a non-family member, which makes our lease illegal. Well, we receive a discharge. Neither one of us are going to have to perform on that lease. In fact, we can't perform on the lease because now our performance would be illegal. So it's factually impossible. Okay, what happens if the performance, though, that's anticipated is not impossible? It just becomes very different because of the change in circumstance than what we anticipated. This is covered under what we call commercial impracticability and or frustration of purpose. I'm going to talk about these as the same. If you look in your textbook, they make a distinction between these, but the concept really between them is the same. So let's take a look at commercial impracticability. This is where we could receive a discharge from our performance because an event outside of our control has made our performance much more costly or difficult than what we originally intended. And these are things, again, that are outside of our control. I like to say for commercial impracticability, there are two main factors. The outside event has to be uncontrollable and reasonably unforeseeable. Right? It's not a normal risk that we undertake with this type of contract. It's completely uncontrollable, out of our control, and a reasonable person would not foresee this kind of thing happening. So I have some examples of, frustration of purpose or temporary possibility, commercial impracticability. These are things like a war breaks out that we could not have anticipated, an act of God, a tornado, a hurricane that makes our performance, next to impossible. Even an industry-wide labor strike that neither one of us created that happens, that could make it commercially impracticable. I always like to use this example or story. We used to have a business law professor at WIU that worked for Ryder Truck International. And he did a lot of international contracts with Ryder Truck, the moving company. And one of his contracts he had in the country of Iraq. And it was right around the time of the Gulf War. And so Ryder Truck had contracted to move some things, I think it was from the southern end of Iraq to the northern end of Iraq. And literally, before performance was accomplished, a war broke out, the Gulf War, right in the middle. And, even though it would have been, I guess, not impossible to make that delivery, performance now became much more difficult than what they originally intended. I mean, there were literally landmines in between. And yeah, they might have been able to make it. But Ryder Truck said, no, we're not performing this. Now performance has become commercially impracticable, and we've received a discharge because this war was uncontrollable and reasonably unforeseeable. And they were discharged from that contract. Let's take a look at what courts will look at in making this determination. There are certain factors that the court will consider in determining impracticability. One thing we know, mere financial difficulties will not suffice. So normal risks that you would undertake in a contract, like a rise in prices because the market just changes, those courts will not call impracticable. Those are normal risks associated with any contract, and a court will not let you out of it just because prices go up. Right? In fact, that's a lot of the reason that we use contracts in the first place, is to lock in a certain price, right? And so just a rise in prices or inputs or something like that, a cost of them, that's not going to let you out of it. That's a normal risk. Again, the event that occurs, the intervening event, must be unexpected, reasonably unforeseeable, and uncontrollable. It also amounts to a significant change in the means necessary to perform. Not that just it makes it more difficult, but that it makes it significantly more difficult. Sometimes parties to a contract will include in their contract what we call a force majeure clause, right? And that's a clause in the contract that has specific language saying that one or both parties will be discharged from performance in the event of an act of God or the like, and a lot of times these clauses in the contract will even list different events that happen. And courts will look at those, but they're not always determinative. Just because it says one event is covered in the contract, the court may still determine that it is either covered or not covered. But that's up to the discretion of the court and the facts of the case. And then last, the UCC. The UCC does allow for major unforeseen events or disruptions to discharge performance. So in other words, commercial impracticability is represented or is recognized by the UCC. One last example that I want to give on this commercial impracticability came from a real-life case of mine. And I don't know the answer to it, and so I'll just kind of leave it to you to come up with an answer to this one. But the facts were basically this. I represented a local farmer who raised pigs. And he raised them from birth and grew them to a certain weight. And then when they reached a certain weight, he would sell them. And he found a buyer up in northern Illinois who contracted to buy the pigs. And the contract read that the farmer buying the pigs would buy a load of pigs every 2 months. And a load was defined, I think, as somewhere between 50 and 150 pigs at a certain weight. And so the contract was all defined. And there was a certain price that was locked in for 2 years, a price at which this farmer would buy the pigs. So they performed on the contract. They began performing for about 6 to 9 months. And then the farmer in northern Illinois sent a notice to my client, farmer here in western Illinois, saying that he had contracted a disease. I mean, not himself personally, but his hog barn had contracted this disease, and it killed his whole herd of pigs. In fact, every pig or load of pigs that they put into these buildings on his farm contracted this disease and died. And so he consulted, veterinarians and other people, and they said the only way to get rid of the disease was to completely tear down the hog buildings and start over. And of course, he couldn't afford to do this. So he sent a notice saying, I'm not going to be accepting any more pigs. So because of this, I've been discharged from the contract and stopped performing, stopped sending pigs. Well, my client looked at this and said, well, wait a minute. What am I going to do with these pigs? I mean, you can't exactly stop them from coming, right? And so, what am I going to do? I still have these pigs, that are going to be born soon, and I need somewhere to sell them. And by the way, that's the reason I entered into the contract, was to get this price for this many pigs. And so one thing led to another. The seller farmer, the farmer here in western Illinois, found another buyer in Iowa to buy them. But of course, the Iowa buyer only offered a lower price. And so over the rest of the life of the contract, this lower price amounted to somewhere around $75,000. So the farmer here, who was my client in western Illinois, asked, can we sue? Can we sue the farmer in northern Illinois who stopped performing for breach of contract? And so I sent a letter, and I outlined the situation, and basically said that the farmer in northern Illinois had breached the contract and owes us damages in the amount of roughly $75,000. I then got a letter back from the northern Illinois farmer's lawyer citing the UCC and the section on commercial impracticability, and said, no, we have not breached the contract. We've been discharged from performance by commercial impracticability. This disease was uncontrollable and unforeseeable, and it discharged us from having to perform. Not a bad argument. We were headed to trial on this when I had to withdraw. Actually, I had to withdraw because I started teaching here at Western. So I don't know whatever happened as a result of that case. But if those parties went to court, I can tell you what probably was going to happen was that they would have what I would call dueling veterinarians, expert witnesses who could come in and inform the court on whether this disease was truly reasonably foreseeable or controllable. Because again, when we come back to commercial impracticability, remember the outside event, like in this case the disease, has to be uncontrollable and reasonably unforeseeable. My client, I know, contacted a veterinarian who said that no, this disease isn't all that uncommon, and it's foreseeable, and there could have been precautions taken. And the other side contacted a veterinarian who says exactly the opposite. No, this is a completely rare disease. No one could have seen this coming, and it was uncontrollable and unforeseeable. So sometimes it's a question of fact. And like in this case, it probably come down to dueling expert witnesses and who the court chose to believe.